Hey folks, this is Dev. Before we get into this episode, I wanted to warn you that the audio is a little bit rough, particularly on my end. Huge apologies for that. I know it's a rough start to a new podcast. I didn't want to re-record it because some of the conversation that Hugh and I have in this episode I feel is really good and worth keeping. Please try and stick with it. I promise you'll love the episode if you do. Good morning, people of the internet. You're listening to Debi Radio 79.5 FM, a podcast where we discuss the movie Grosse Pointe Blank, 1 minute at a time. I'm Dev.
And I'm Hugh, and on today's show we're going to be looking at the very first minute of the film, starting with the logo for the production company and ending with the credits for the actors.
Alright, should we dive into this?
Let's go for it.
Alright, I think we got to take it from the top, right?
We got to take it from the top. So, what is the very first thing we see on screen? It is the logo of now defunct Shingle Hollywood Pictures. And what does that mean, folks? That means that you're looking at a film that's very hard to find these days. If you want a good quality disc of it, you're talking to fans of Grosse Pointe Blank, which means you're talking to fans of 90s films, which means you're talking to fans of physical media. And we miss it when there's not a nice, good, solid edition of something. Yeah, you can buy a Blu-ray. Yeah, you can stream it. But Hollywood Pictures, subdivision of Disney, created to do more movies of more adult nature, having had some success with Touchstone. And there's a number of their films that you'll know now if you buy it on disc. It'll be under the Touchstone regime, such as Michael Bay's The Rock. They started out with things like Arachnophobia from Amblin Entertainment and had a number of flops before they really hit their stride. That said, Grosse Pointe Blank is one of those films that if you mention it, it's like it's still the old school fandom and nerdery, right? You mention that and someone goes, "Oh my god, I like that film," and you know the kind of person you're talking to. Whereas, there's other films these guys did that are nothing like that, right? Like, nobody remembers Medicine Man. I saw it in the cinema with Sean Connery. Nobody remembers that film because it's frankly not very good.
and honestly, like, it was quite a prolific studio. It had a lot of films come out. And for me, someone of my age, they may not all be favorites. They may not be ones that I remember with particular fondness. But I do remember a huge number of these that, were, even if they weren't necessarily great overall, had some element to them that was particularly memorable. Sometimes for all the wrong reasons. I'm looking at New Super Mario Brothers.
Yep.
Sometimes just for some really interesting ideas, right? Like Dead Presidents is still like an
Great
incredible
movie.
But flawed film in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. But the many of the flaws are corrected by the director's cut, which is missing in action unless you have the Laserdisc.
I didn't even know there was one. I'm gonna have to try and find that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that people talk about. This is why now that Criterion have done their beautiful 4K remaster of the Hughes brothers' first film, and its name escapes me very suddenly, but it should be obvious to everyone who's listening if you know who the Hughes brothers are. But we're all hoping, fingers crossed, that somehow somebody finds the licensing for Dead Presidents and gets it through. But my assumption is anything that has ever been on this list is owned by Disney now, because that's who set up the Shingle. So, like, but there's some real there's modern classics in the sense of Joy Luck Club, Tombstone, The Rock itself, Quiz Show, which got Oscar nominated if memory serves. Don't remember if it got one. Crimson Tide, Dangerous Minds. These films still hold their pattern. Oliver Stone's Nixon. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff there that I think people would hold very kind of kindly to looking back on, rather than a lot of the trashier stuff that I quite like, like Deep Rising, which I love. But yeah, so that's the first thing you see on screen, and this is the kind of podcast you're listening to, folks. We're going to talk about film nerdery in depth because we just talked about the opening logo. For how long there, Dev?
We're getting up there. We're not doing too badly, honestly. I know that a lot of the minute by minute podcasts that I'm a huge fan of struggle with opening credits and with the closing credits. And
okay.
Honestly, I think for us and for our interest areas, and I think in all honesty, for you in particular, this is possibly going to provide some of the richest material because you have such deep knowledge of so many of the people involved, so many of the companies involved, because you have a whole wealth of background in cinematography and filmmaking.
I
Um,
mean, yeah, for the people who obviously welcome listeners, and who are you listening to here? Well, in my case, while I am currently a secondary school teacher, I did 10 years plus in DVD and film, working for a number of different independent companies, including working in Western releases of Japanese anime, which is where Dev and I met, and then working on horror genre film from Asia and Europe, and eventually finished my career up as a head of marketing for the now very recently defunct network DVD in the UK, which handled ITV's back catalogue. That's America. That's one of the three big TV channels here. Before going to work for a startup magazine that failed on cult television. So I was the editor and writer for that. So my background is very much in this field, but it's also, yes, I was an obsessive movie nerd. So, for me, it was, I always explain it like this, right? If sports fans talk about stats, they talk about people, they talk about, moments, they talk about when this happened, where and why, and what were the circumstances under which these players achieved what they achieved. And that's what I do with film. That's what I've always done with film and TV, right? And music, for that matter. It's like with music, I love a band, but I'll look at the producer and go, okay, that guy is interesting. So, oh, look, he produced these other guys. So let me go listen to them. And that's how I approach cultural artifacts, media, all that stuff. Is, you find more of what you might like if you start looking at the people who are behind what you like.
I think that's something that people tend to overlook a lot, including myself. Honestly,
Okay.
it's easily done with the lead actors or the cast of a movie, maybe
Mm-hmm.
with some of the really most prominent of directors.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, I think people don't actually go in and look at script writers very often. Aaron
Mm-hmm.
Sorkin may be a notable exception there.
Mm-hmm.
People don't look at production companies and the types of film that production
Mm-hmm.
companies tend to favor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we were kind of talking about Hollywood Pictures here having some hits, some misses, but a lot of influential movies for that time. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there are Touchstone Pictures is another one that has a very very similar kind of scope, both being
Yep.
subsidiaries of Disney,
Yep.
um, both kind of targeting movies that they wanted to make but weren't going to work well under the Disney brand,
Yep.
which I think is less of a concern these days given how much Disney has expanded. But at the time was very front of mind, I think, for most of the Disney execs, that
Yeah.
Disney needed to retain that family friendliness, and
I
you can't do that with this kind of movie.
I do wonder, looking at how many of the films on that shingle became like either cable hits or VHS hits. I do wonder how much at the time people were saying, "Oh, yeah, this is only going to do so in cinemas, but we'll make it back on VHS." Because one of the things that younger film fans often seem to forget in their own sports like passion to follow box office is that, I mean, you and I met nearly 20 years ago, and I was in DVD then, and even then, we were already starting to not worry about box office was not relevant, right? Um, Theatrical was marketing for the DVD. Like, as long as I was in the business, that was a given. That was not, like, no, very few people were going to argue with you on that. At least at the indie level. Blockbuster may be different, but I know from people who are still in the business today, they get very frustrated when you see headlines like, "Oh, film so and so was released for 1 week and made $20," and it's like, yeah, nobody in the business thinks it was going to do better than that. That wasn't the point. Literally not the point. You do it so that you get, at least here in England, for example, if you had a theatrical release, it meant that the major newspapers had to review you in that week's releases. So you suddenly multiply your marketing, boom, straight away, just through the. So your theatrical is effectively a cost against getting loads and loads of reviews in mainstream press.
Yeah, I do wonder a little bit because I my day job now is in advertising, and I've
Mm,
watched how reluctant and how slow that transition to digital advertising has been in the industry, and I
mm-hmm,
feel like that was actually a huge hurdle for
mm-hmm,
the industry even at this time, right? We're talking
mm-hmm.
97 for Grosse Pointe
Yep.
Blank.
Mm-hmm,
I think that is the point where we start to hit that normalization of VHS, which is
mm-hmm,
20
mm-hmm.
years after the technology came about, right? And it wasn't
Yeah,
super quickly
15.
adopted. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah. No
VHS
fair.
is, yeah, 77, but it
Oh
it
yeah, good. Yeah, true. So yeah.
so so it it takes a while for that to be readily available in homes, right?
Mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm,
even then, I think there's a lot of comfort and security in relying on that theatrical distribution model that is closer to 100 years old at the point this film comes out
mm-hmm,
than a technology that still seems relatively infant. But you're
mm-hmm,
right, like this is the point where it's changing, right? This is the point where, you know, a company like Hollywood Pictures can pump out, you
mm,
know, a dozen movies a year, or
mm,
half a dozen at least,
mm,
and be confident on getting returns, knowing that they're
mm-hmm,
hitting a decent spectrum of the demographic,
mm-hmm,
and people, even if they aren't going to buy it outright, aren't even going to necessarily see it in the cinema, are
mm-hmm.
going to maybe rent it once or possibly two, three times from Blockbuster or
Yeah,
wherever it is they're getting it
and
from.
97 is also at this point you've also been getting movies via pay per view like HBO for quite some time. And so
Right.
there's also that as well as a revenue stream. I mean, pay per view has, again, it's one of the things film fans don't always talk about, is the degree to which particularly for indie companies, a deal with a pay per view company can often pay for the licensing of a film. Like when I was at Network, we would buy foreign films, and foreign to the UK, obviously. My boss at the time, who passed away very recently, actually in the last year, he had a thing for Latin American and Hispanic language films, and we would always end up with these films from various festivals around the world that were not going to do huge. They were only going to do, I don't know, we'd be lucky to sell 1,000 copies on DVD. We're looking at hundreds, but the money was made back by selling it to somebody like Sky Arts, so UK satellite channel. Selling it to Channel 4 after that, and like that, those deals alone would put you in profit. And the other thing people never talked about for years, which again is like a crucial part of these films of making money, is hotels, cruises, airlines. The deals for those, no joke, the deals for those can often, put you straight over into the black very easily, just because of the amount of places that will be showing it.
Yeah.
So
If you can strike the deal, and I think
absolutely,
there
that's
can
the
be a
key.
challenge. Yeah.
Well, looking at the product from Hollywood pictures, there's definitely some I can imagine. I mean, I flew a bit back then. I don't remember seeing many of these. These are not the titles you would see on an airline back then. But I'm just saying that there's certain comedies there they did that I think would end up. I don't see Grosse Pointe Blank because they were still airlines were still very anti-violence back then. And the BBFC over here was still scissoring Michael Bay films and whatnot. But
Yeah.
you know, um, yeah, I think Grosse Pointe Blank would have been. I mean, I don't know. How did you? Okay, so two things, right? How did I've said my background? Your background is you now work in advertising,
I
right?
do, yeah. So Hugh and I met almost 20 years ago now, when I was working for him at ADV Films.
You came up
Uh,
to me at a film festival.
I
and
did.
pitched
That's
yourself
true.
and said, "Do you have any jobs?" And I said, "No." And you said, "Well, do you have any interns?" And I said, "I said we haven't started a program up it." And you were like, "Well, as soon as it happens,
Yeah.
hit me up." And I was like, "Okay."
Yeah. That's pretty much it. I was in engineering at the time and didn't want to be there, and
Mm,
made got that opportunity, which opened my eyes to marketing and advertising, and
yeah.
that kind of navigated the course of my career. Um, I I have always half wanted to go hardcore into the movie side of things, N-
Okay.
and I've always balked at it because I have a strong suspicion that if I went too far down that rabbit hole, I'd stop
Yeah.
enjoying it. And I think it's something where it could really kill the magic for me if it became the job.
Okay.
Uh, and I think that's kind of where I always ended up. I love it. I love watching movies. I love dissecting movies to an extent that drives most people I know nuts. And I think Hugh can relate to that one. Uh,
You-
but I kind of want to leave it as like some semi-educated amateur. Like
hmm
I have never visited the website TV tropes because
Oh,
I know that if I start going down that and reading into that, it's going to just frustrate me too much. I'm going to be focused too much on the identification of those tropes at the expense of the core enjoyment.
okay. Um, that's interesting because you have said to me before that you thought I was burning out on things in exactly that manner.
Yeah.
The person who was our boss at the time at ADV Films UK also said to me that she was worried that if I ever went to Japan, it would I would lose my interest in animation and manga, and therefore, in a weird way, it was actually kind of useful for her not to have me go there, right? Because I remained a passionate fan about it all. Because once she got me to America, it actually completely did do that to me. It upset my notion of what I was getting out of American made films and what I thought they were about in some ways. And it really did kind of prejudice me against them in a really strong way, in terms of personal enjoyment of them. And so that's kind of, it does happen. I mean, somebody asked Guillermo del Toro a while back in a press junket for a film he produced, not directed, and they said, "Oh, what kind of horror films do you like at the moment?" And he was like, the problem is I'm not enjoying many at the moment because I don't need I know I've been behind the curtain. I know how the sausage is made, and I think that's a perfectly fair statement. There is a point where you get to that level, and either you come out the other side with a greater appreciation of how hard it is to make a film and therefore the enjoyment you can have from it, or you lose interest. And I think you're very sensible to avoid the theory and the study of it. Once you go down that rabbit hole, I mean, there's a lot of fan culture out there that is very much to, people pronouncing in great depth with very little actual knowledge, but the little knowledge they have is enough, they think, to pronounce in a grand manner. And I don't think that that is, you know, I'm not saying that you have to be a chef to criticize the food, but I think you're a more interesting critic if you know how the sausage is made.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think for me, if I'd been in more of a community
Mm-hmm.
of people with my mindset of really enjoying films, I
Mm.
think it as a group adventure, it could have been exciting and fun. And I kind of going to a completely different movie. I kind of feel like that was a big part of Edgar Wright, Simon Pegg, Nick Frost's
Mm-hmm.
journey.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Was
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were further down the path before they met, but that group discovery was
Mm.
exciting, and you lean on each other and you reinforce that way. And I don't think I ever had that, and I don't think I had the stamina to get through that barrier on my own.
Interesting. Because you went to a university with some very interesting cinema links, and if memory serves, a reasonably active cinema soc. So, are
And
you
yet I
talking
never
about?
joined it.
I know this is what I was about to ask you.
Yeah.
So yeah, and presumably at school you didn't have a lot of friends who were also into it to the same degree.
No, definitely not,
You
actually.
see, that was where I got lucky. You know, 80s being the 80s, it was I got lucky by walking into a comic shop and also I had enough friends at school who dug a lot of this stuff. To be fair, but once I walked into the comic shop and met all these people who were as head over heels as I was, and you just drink coffee and from the cafe around the corner and stand there yakking for hours about things. That's yeah. Some of us got lucky like that. I think that's you can see why people today love it when they go to their first convention or they go to their first society meeting and meet like-minded people. But also gatekeepers and trolls can be very off-putting, and they do exist. And you know, and as I said, they can be very dangerous with very little knowledge. I think people should, yeah, I want people to just enjoy things because they enjoy them. But I personally love enjoying things because I understand how things get put together. And sometimes that increases the enjoyment. I like a lot of movies I know you think are bad movies and other people think are bad movies. Um, but I like them because A, I get a kick out of them watching them, and B, yeah, just in terms of emotional response. But I enjoy how they are put together,
Mm, yeah.
because I know what it takes, and so I can look at a low budget film and go, the ambition here is to do this. How far have they succeeded? My enjoyment is often related directly to the degree to which they do or don't succeed up there at what they're intending to do.
So we also have on this opening minute George Armitage's credit as director
Yes,
for the film.
yes.
Um, I think you're more familiar with his body of work as a whole than I am. Do you want to speak a little bit to kind of what he's done, what he's famous for, and where this fits in?
Okay, so Armitage came to a lot of us kind of 80s nerds in terms of our recognition of him as a director. It was quite late in the day, to be honest. He directed a film which has just been reissued here in the UK, actually, called Miami Blues. Now, that was in 1990. It had a young Alec Baldwin in it. It was based on a fairly well-known crime novel, and it sort of captured the particular flavor of that novelist's work and its setting. Tonally, it was unusual. It's basically Tarantino before Tarantino, right? And Armitage did that. But what's interesting is that was his first movie in 11 years. Like he started out in the 70s. And funnily enough, the one that I have actually seen that is the black sort of semi black exploitationer Hitman. He aimed to please, uh, which has got Bernie Casey and Pam Grier.
Oh, classic. Okay, yeah. Oh,
Right?
right, right.
He starts out in that area and then sort of find somewhere along the line he just kind of develops this style. I mean, he did a TV movie in '79. Very little direction afterwards. Although he's a producer and a writer on a number of other things along the way. And then Miami Blues comes along and just kind of blows up. People because Fred Ward's in it, and Fred Ward plays the cop character who's the lead in the books, and it does a really great job of being the grizzled old cop. And um, Baldwin is the young lawbreaker who nicks his badge, and so the cop goes after him. You can see how this turns into fun stuff, but it's
Yeah,
got a very irreverent tone to it. It isn't like Grosse Pointe. It prefigures Grosse Pointe Blank in that sense. It's not afraid to be violent when it needs to be, gritty when it needs to be. And I think it's also interesting that while it wasn't particularly well received, the next time he directs after Grosse Pointe Blank, so Grosse Pointe Blank is 7 years later after Miami Blues, right? The next time he directs after that is The Big Bounce in 2004, which is an Elmore Leonard adaptation, and in theory that should have been like a perfect marriage of talent, but it wasn't, which is is widely regarded as a bit of as added to the pile of failed Elmore Leonard films, which is kind of a shame because I think it's got some good things going for it. But yeah, I mean, he was nominated for a Primetime Emmy at one point, and he in 2015 he in Germany at the Oldenburg Film Festival he was given an award for the retrospective of his career. So the guy, and he's got standing. I mean, he's people know who, if you're, he's one of those names that when you're a film buff, you probably know who he is. But if you're not a film buff, you probably only know Grosse Pointe Blank and maybe Miami Blues, you know? But
Yeah.
he's got talent. He's a talented guy. I think he produces crisp, lean films that are like he hasn't a lot. He's never gone down that road of excess. Like these guys who came up in the 80s directing movies are like throw some more money at it, make it bigger. And this is, he still makes things like it's the 70s. They're lean, they're mean, they're practical, they're on the location, they get it done. There's no kind of mucking around. Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
it's it. I mean, these aren't movies that are going to push the definition of special effects, right?
no,
Um,
precisely. Which is
yeah,
probably why he did so few films.
absolutely. Because I think at the time he's coming in, especially the '90s period,
Mm,
that's not what the producers are really wanting, right? They're
hmm
wanting the big blockbusters. The summer blockbuster is here, and they want to
mm,
have that.
mm.
They don't want to be making a big screen movie with a TV show budget.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think it's. I'm glad he's still around, and getting awards. I'm glad he's still kind of, I'm glad we're seeing. He's just one of those guys I wish made more films. Like, we're looking at Grosse Pointe Blank. Don't you wish there were more films like Grosse Pointe Blank?
I absolutely do. I absolutely do
Yeah.
for so many reasons, which is why I coerced you into doing this podcast because this is straight up my favorite movie of all time, right? Ever
Okay.
since I discovered the movies by minute format,
Yeah.
this is the film that I wanted to do. I love listening to all of the others. A lot of my childhood favorites, right? The
Okay.
Goonies or Princess Bride, or of course Star Wars Minute who kicked this all off. But
Right.
the one that I felt like I would be comfortable trying to talk about for 15-30 minutes for
Mm-hmm.
every minute of the movie
Mm-hmm.
was without doubt Grosse Point Blank. It has
Mm-hmm.
um, such good pacing. It has some really fantastic action sequences,
Mm-hmm.
and it has what I have come to learn is not, in fact, just a really, really uh, fast-paced script, but the lack of a script in some areas, right? Like George Armitage is allowing the cast to ad lib to a degree that really brings out their characters so
Yeah.
much more than I think the script would have.
Yeah.
But also, the script makes no apologies for the audience, right? The script
Right.
is not babysitting people through the the stages of the movie that in a manner that we've come to expect, and I find frustratingly patronizing.
Right.
Um, there are references that I mean we'll see in like the first 5 or 10 minutes of the movie,
Mm.
allusions to things that don't get explained until 2/3 of the way through the movie in a completely
Right.
unrelated scene.
Right.
Um, that kind of lack of exposition just doesn't happen in movies anymore, and
Okay.
didn't even happen all that often in my experience in movies of this time, and especially not movies
Right.
that were this engaging.
Right.
Um, they tend to become the more intellectual, thinky movies, and this, really isn't that. It doesn't want to be that. It's just a fun movie, but you watch it over and over again, and you see all of those threads where everything is playing in from a previous comment or a previous uh, dialogue between the characters,
Mm.
which has kept me engaged through watching this film so many times.
I am fascinated at the idea that this is your favorite movie of all time, right? Like you've explained why, and I get it completely. But when I think about all the films over the years you and I've discussed, and those films you've given me jip for, like,
So
I
many of
kind of
them.
yeah, I find it interesting that this is now that knowing that this is your favorite film, it's like this is the yardstick. It's like, well, no wonder you don't think I should be holding in high regard some of these films, other films, because yeah, Grosse Pointe Blank is a perfect storm. It is an absolute gem, and it is that gem because of all the various things that make up film production, including, as you said, allowing ad libs, going off script, going with the flow, the creative talent of being there on the day about shooting the scene and going, what if we try this? And knowing how to integrate that into the finished product.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So
Um,
that's
yeah,
what we're going to be talking about for all the future podcasts.
it is indeed. We're going to have a few guests along the way to help us out, so you won't just be listening to us go super esoteric into film lore. But
No, someone
yes,
else can do that. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So that was minute one of the Grosse Pointe Blank podcast, Debi Radio 79.5 FM, featuring your hosts, co-writers and co-producers, Dev Soligar and Hugh David. You can find us all and your favorite podcast players, as well as where else, Dev, can they find us?
you can also find us on YouTube, on Twitter, and Spotify, all of those at Debi Radio, as well as on our website, debiradio.com. And for all of those, it's DEBI Radio.
Sure was clear that all of this was new. Concentrating hard like a little girl, smoking for the first time. It wasn't a moment, it was a feeling.